The night had settled over the house like a cold and heavy shroud, the kind that presses itself against the windows and makes even the familiar silhouette of your own living room look distorted and unwelcoming, as if the darkness itself were leaning closer just to see what you would do next. And I remember standing there at the threshold between hallway and kitchen, holding a mug still warm from the coffee I had tried to drink earlier, and thinking that nothing about this night felt ordinary. Not even the silence, which had an almost tangible weight to it, like an exhale I could not identify, pulsing through the walls with a presence that made my skin rise in a quiet warning I had learned over the years never to ignore. Even then, I did not understand why my chest felt tight, or why I kept glancing at the door at the end of the hallway as though expecting it to move, but somewhere in my mind, I sensed that whatever was about to unfold had already begun, long before I noticed any change, and that I was only now stepping into a story that had been quietly building itself around me. My son had gone to bed 2 hours earlier after spending the afternoon with a school friend I had only met briefly at pickup, a boy who seemed polite but withdrawn, a little pale under the porch light, and whose eyes flicked toward our front door with a stiffness that did not match the easy smile he tried to wear, and although I brushed it aside at the time, I now felt that same stiffness echoing inside me as a low and persistent anxiety. The house creaked lightly as old houses do, but tonight each sound carried intention, like footsteps of something unseen shifting its weight in the spaces I could not reach. I had just placed the mug on the counter when I heard the soft but unmistakable rustle from upstairs, that subtle whisper of movement that tells you someone is awake even if you cannot yet hear their voice. And for a moment I hesitated, wondering whether it was simply my son getting up for water or something else entirely, because the sound repeated with a rhythm that did not quite match the slow padding of a sleepy child. Before I could call out, I heard the thump of hurried steps racing down the stairs, and when I turned I saw him standing there halfway down, gripping the railing like he was afraid of letting go, his face pale and his hair tousled from sleep, but his eyes wide with something much sharper than simple fear. It was the kind of look children only get when they have seen something they cannot explain, but desperately want someone else to understand. He opened his mouth to speak, but before any sound came out, we both heard the knock. It was soft at first, barely more than a brush against wood, but it came again, with a strange precision that froze the air around us. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more. Not loud enough to signal urgency, but too deliberate to ignore. I walked toward the door even as every instinct inside me coiled with tension, and my son's hand shot outward in a silent plea for me to stop. Yet I kept moving because a parent's first impulse is always to protect, even if we are walking straight toward the very thing we wish to keep our children away from. The hallway felt longer with each step, stretching out like a tunnel carved from shadow, and as I approached the door, I could see the faintest distortion along the bottom edge as though something pressed lightly against it from the outside, testing the boundary between our world and whatever waited beyond. I reached for the lock almost automatically, but before my fingers touched the metal, my son's voice finally found itself again, raw with urgency as he screamed the words that would mark the true beginning of everything that followed. "Don't open that door." His voice cracked with a fear so visceral I felt it inside my bones, and I turned to him sharply, startled not just by the volume but by the certainty behind it, the certainty of someone who wasn't merely afraid of the unknown, but of something he already believed to be real. I stepped back slightly and crouched down to his level, trying to steady my voice even though I could feel a strange tremor rising inside me as the knocking returned once more, still soft, still methodical, and still terribly patient. I asked him why, what he thought was outside, what he had heard or seen, but he only shook his head with a shiver that ran through his whole body, and for a moment he looked like he wanted to say more, but couldn't bring himself to force the words out. I placed a hand on his arm, and that small gesture seemed to break something loose within him because suddenly he took a breath so sharp it was almost a gasp, and whispered that he wasn't the one who had seen it, that it wasn't his story to tell. He said it was his friend, the boy who had spent the afternoon here, the boy who had left earlier than planned, pale and quiet, glancing over his shoulder as though afraid something had followed him. My son swallowed hard before finishing, voice trembling with a memory that seemed too heavy for him to carry alone, and he told me that his friend had warned him before leaving the house, gripping his wrist as he whispered words that did not make sense at the time, but now echoed like a prophecy fulfilled. He said that if it knocked, we must not open the door under any circumstances, and that he would explain everything later. But at the time, my son thought it was just a strange joke or a childish attempt to be mysterious. Now, though, with the knocking pulsing through the house like a heartbeat we did not want to acknowledge, the warning felt heavier, real, something ancient in its simplicity. I stood slowly, heart hammering as I stepped between my son and the door, listening as the space behind the wood seemed to shift, as though leaning forward in anticipation. The house felt suspended in a tension I could almost taste, metallic and sharp, and the shadows along the walls stretched themselves thin like dark fingers reaching toward the threshold. I could hear my son breathing behind me, each inhale tight and uneven, and I knew that whatever my next decision was would not simply be about curiosity or caution, but about protection, survival, and the unspoken truth that a parent's fear grows in direct proportion to the terror reflected in their child's eyes. Something was wrong here, deeply wrong, and the warning from his friend now seemed less like the anxious imagination of a young boy, and more like a desperate attempt to keep us from becoming part of something we did not understand. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It seeped into the room like a cold mist, wrapping itself around every thought and breath, until I could hear nothing but the echo of my own pulse. I forced myself to step back from the door, away from whatever lingered on the other side, and turned to pull my son close. He pressed his face against my chest as his shoulders shook in quiet fear, and I knew we had reached a line we could not cross without consequences we were not prepared to face. I whispered that everything was going to be okay, because that is what parents are supposed to say, even when we are not sure it is true, and I guided him back up the stairs toward the safety of his room, though safety itself felt like a fragile illusion now. Halfway up, I looked back one last time, expecting perhaps to see the shadow of feet beneath the door, or the subtle movement of the doorknob turning, but there was nothing except the thick, unmoving darkness pooled at the base of the hallway, waiting. If you've read this far, let me know in the comments how you think you would react if you heard that kind of knock in the middle of the night, with a warning you don't understand still echoing in your mind. I truly want to know what instinct would guide you in that moment. As we reached the top of the stairs and entered his room, I could feel my own breathing beginning to steady, though the tension in my chest had not eased, and as I tucked him in, his eyes darted toward the bedroom door instead of closing. He asked if it would come back. I told him I didn't know. The truth felt dangerous, but so did a lie. The house around us seemed to listen, its silence humming with expectation. I sat beside him until he drifted into an uneasy sleep, though every so often his brow would tighten as though still caught in the memory of whatever his friend had seen. When he finally settled into stillness, I stood again and walked quietly back to the hallway, stopping midway with the heavy realization that I wasn't just afraid anymore. I was being watched. The house felt alive with attention I could not see, and for a long moment, I simply stood there, listening to the deep thrum of the night pressing against the windows, waiting for the noise to return, waiting for something to reveal itself in the dark. I did not yet know that this night was only the beginning of a much deeper mystery, one that tied my family to something far older and far stranger than the quiet street we lived on. I did not know that the knocking was not a random act, but an invitation, or perhaps a test, or maybe even a warning that came too late. All I knew was that my son's friend had glimpsed something the night before, something powerful enough to make a child tremble, and that whatever he saw had now followed us home. The following morning arrived with the kind of stillness that makes you wonder whether the world outside your windows has momentarily paused, holding its breath, as though the night itself had not entirely released its grip on time. The light that slipped through the curtains was pale and hesitant, like sunlight filtered through ash, and for a long time I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling, each creak now an echo of the night before, each whisper of air against the walls a memory refusing to fade. My son was still asleep, though his face looked troubled even in rest, and I couldn't stop replaying his words from the night before, the desperate tone in his voice when he told me not to open the door, the way he said it wasn't his story to tell but his friend's. There was something buried in those words, something that lingered like an aftertaste of fear, and I knew I couldn't just let it go. By mid-morning, I had made myself a second cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window staring out at the quiet suburban street. Everything appeared ordinary: neighbors walking dogs, cars passing, a mail carrier moving from house to house. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, I could feel a strange dissonance, a subtle wrongness that couldn't be seen but could be felt, like static under your skin. I decided to call the boys' parents, partly out of concern, partly to make sense of what had happened. The number was in my phone from a message exchange the previous day, and as it rang, my heart beat with the strange anticipation of someone expecting not just an answer, but a revelation. The call went to voicemail. I tried again later. Same result. I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe the boy had simply been frightened by a nightmare or a story he'd heard, that children sometimes carry fear like shadows from one house to another, and that it was my mind, not the house, feeding the unease. But when I walked past the front door, I couldn't help noticing the faintest mark near the bottom of the wood, a thin smear of grayish residue, almost like ash or soot, shaped not by accident, but by contact, as if something had rested there too long. I bent down to touch it and instantly pulled my hand back. The wood felt cold, not just the temperature of the room kind of cold, but an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my fingertips like a pulse moving backward. When my son woke, I asked him if he'd spoken to his friend that morning, and he said no. He'd tried texting but hadn't gotten a reply. He hesitated before saying that the boy's house wasn't far, that maybe we could check in person, and I agreed almost without thinking, though a part of me already knew that whatever answers we were seeking would not come easily. As we walked down the street, the air felt oddly heavy, the way it does before a storm, and each step seemed to carry us closer, not just to another home but to another layer of something unseen yet waiting. The boy's house was a modest single story with a yard full of tall grass that looked neglected, though not abandoned. The windows were shut, curtains drawn, and even from the sidewalk I could feel that same strange weight pressing outward from within. I knocked on the door, calling out softly, but there was no response. My son tugged gently at my sleeve, whispering that he didn't think we should be there. Then, just as I was about to turn away, the curtain beside the door shifted. Someone was watching. A face appeared for barely a second, pale and thin, eyes wide and frightened. It was the boy, but before I could say his name, he vanished back into the darkness of the room, and the curtain fell back into stillness. I knocked again, louder this time, calling out that we just wanted to make sure everything was all right, that I was his friend's parent, but the only reply was silence and the faint sound of something moving inside, slow, dragging, uneven. My son took a step backward, gripping my hand tightly, and in that moment, I made the decision to leave. Something inside that house was wrong, and I could feel that by staying, I was trespassing into a space that didn't belong to us. We walked back home in silence, the sound of our footsteps oddly hollow against the pavement. And though the sun was still high, the air had the cool edge of late evening. Once home, I locked the door, an action that felt more like a ritual than a precaution, and for the first time noticed that the lock itself had a faint residue on it, the same grayish dust as before, only now it was thicker, almost smeared as though brushed by fingers. I wiped it away, but the unease it left behind clung to me. That night, I tried to stay awake. I told myself it was only to ensure my son slept peacefully, but the truth was that I was waiting for something I could not name but could feel drawing nearer with each passing hour. Around midnight, just as I began to drift into that hazy border between waking and sleep, I heard it again, the knock. Same rhythm, same patience. The sound traveled through the air like a whisper wearing skin. I froze. The house seemed to hold its breath again, as though remembering. I rose quietly and made my way to the hallway. My son appeared almost instantly, his small frame silhouetted by the faint light spilling from his bedroom. He didn't need to say anything. I could see the recognition in his eyes, the dread that mirrored my own. We stood together at the top of the stairs, staring down at the door. The knock came again. 5 soft taps this time, spaced evenly apart. Then silence. Then another series, but this time from the back door. The sound echoed through the house like a question demanding an answer. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and before I could move or think, my son spoke in a trembling whisper that froze my blood. He said he thought it was calling for him. I took his hand and guided him back toward his room, closing the door behind us. I turned on the bedside lamp and tried to smile, to reassure him that it was nothing. Maybe the wind, maybe a tree branch, anything but what we both felt it might be. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it, and neither did I. When he finally fell asleep, I sat by the window, watching the yard. The night seemed unnaturally still again, the kind of stillness that feels orchestrated. Then, out near the edge of the lawn, where the light from the porch just barely reached, I saw it. A shape, small, hunched, motionless. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way a person should stand. Its outline seemed to shift when I tried to focus on it, like heat distortion or smoke. And though I couldn't see its face, I knew instinctively that it was watching the house, waiting for movement, waiting for acknowledgement. My breath caught in my chest, and for a long time I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. When I finally did, the shape was gone. Morning came again, pale and cold, and though the world outside looked unchanged, everything inside me felt different, thinner, stretched. I called the school that day, hoping to hear that the boy was there, that everything was normal, but the secretary told me he hadn't shown up. I asked if his parents had called in, and she said no. My stomach turned as the implications began to form. The missing calls, the empty house, the figure outside. Something was connecting these pieces in ways I couldn't yet see. That evening, I made another attempt to reach his parents. Still nothing. Then, around dusk, my phone buzzed. A message. From the boy's number. Just one sentence. He told you not to open it. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart pounding, and then I replied asking who it was, what they meant, whether the boy was safe. There was no answer, only a single typing bubble that appeared for a second, then disappeared. I waited, staring at the phone as the light outside dimmed to gray. When the first knock came again that night, it wasn't on the front door. It came from the inside, from the basement. If you're still with me through this part, tell me in the comments. Would you have gone down there? Would curiosity win over fear? Or would you wait for morning and pretend nothing happened? I really want to know how you'd face that choice. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, holding my breath as the sound echoed again, faint but unmistakable. A rhythm. 3 slow knocks, 1 pause, 2 more. The exact same pattern as before. The air in the hallway had changed. It felt thicker, damp, almost charged. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered but didn't turn on, just a low glow that pulsed once and died, leaving the basement swallowed in darkness. Something was moving down there, slow, deliberate. I could hear the faint scrape of something against concrete, like bare feet dragging across the floor. My instincts screamed to close the door, to run, to take my son and leave, but something rooted me to that spot. Not curiosity, not courage, but a strange pull, as though whatever was down there knew me, expected me, wanted me to listen. And beneath the sound of its movement came something else, a whisper. It wasn't words at first, just breath, shaped like language, but then it became clearer. You opened it. The words didn't come from below anymore. They came from behind me. And as I turned, slowly, too afraid to see but too terrified not to, I realized that the door we had sworn never to open was no longer closed. If you are still with me now, take a deep breath, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because from this moment on, everything begins to unravel, and I want you here when the truth finally comes to light. When I turned toward the door, it stood slightly ajar, the faint line of darkness between the frame and the wood stretching like an open wound, bleeding shadow into the hallway. My first thought was that someone had broken in, that somehow the lock had failed, but when I looked closer I saw the chain latch was still intact, hanging in place as though untouched by any physical hand. The air rushing through that narrow gap carried a smell that was both familiar and wrong. Not rot exactly, not decay, but something older, something like damp stone and smoke, like the breath of a place long sealed away from the light. My son's door creaked softly behind me, and I turned my head just enough to see him standing there, small and trembling, his face half hidden in the dim glow of the nightlight. His voice was barely a whisper when he asked if it had come inside. I couldn't answer because I wasn't sure. I pushed the door closed again, my hand shaking against the cool wood, and this time the latch clicked back with a sound that felt final, like a heartbeat slowing to stillness. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for another knock, another whisper, another sign that something still lingered outside. But the silence was absolute, deep enough that it felt alive. It wasn't until I turned away that I noticed the mark. The same gray residue, smeared across the inside of the door now, faint but visible even in the dark. It hadn't just knocked. It had touched the inside. My pulse thudded painfully in my chest as I backed away, step by step, every sense stretched thin. And when I finally reached the bottom of the staircase, I grabbed my son's hand and led him up without looking back. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The presence. The weight of something unseen pressing against the edges of reality, like a thought you can't erase once it's been spoken aloud. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did he. By morning, the world seemed deceptively normal again. The air was crisp, the sky clear, birds moving across the power lines as if nothing at all had shifted. But something inside the house had changed. The clocks were all off by the same exact minute, each frozen at the time the door had opened. The reflection in the hallway mirror flickered faintly, as though the light had a heartbeat of its own, and my son, once bright and curious, now moved through the day with a quiet heaviness, glancing toward the door every time a sound came from outside. It was later that afternoon when the call finally came. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but I answered it instantly, my voice unsteady. A man's voice spoke, tired and strained, introducing himself as the boy's father. His tone was polite at first, but beneath it was a tremor, a hesitation that sounded too much like fear. He said he was sorry for not answering earlier, that things had been difficult lately, that his son had been unwell. When I asked if everything was all right, the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the space between us. Then he said the words, "I will never forget." His son hadn't been home since the night before last. The room spun around me. I told him his son had been here, that they'd played together, that he'd left our house just before dark. But the father interrupted softly, saying that wasn't possible. His son had never come to visit that day. He had been missing since the previous evening. He'd told his parents he was going to a friend's house, our house, but they'd assumed he'd stayed the night somewhere else when he didn't return. I could hear the father's voice breaking as he spoke, the guilt and confusion tangled together, but all I could do was stare at the front door, at that faint smear of gray dust, and feel the world around me tilt into something that didn't make sense anymore. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, my hands cold against the phone, my thoughts scattering like leaves in wind. My son appeared beside me, small and quiet, and asked if his friend was okay. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tell him that the boy he'd played with might never have left the night before, that perhaps he hadn't even been truly here in the first place. All I could manage was a weak promise that we would help find him, even though part of me feared the boy was closer than either of us realized. That night, the dreams began. They weren't dreams exactly, more like memories that didn't belong to me. I would see flashes of the boy's face, half hidden in shadow, his lips moving as though whispering something urgent. Then, behind him, that same door, slightly open, with a darkness pressing against it from the other side. Every time I tried to step closer, I would wake with my heart racing, the taste of ash on my tongue, the faint echo of that knock still reverberating in my ears. My son had the same dreams. I knew because I would find him sitting up in bed at dawn, staring at the wall, his eyes glassy and unfocused, whispering words I could barely understand. Something about it waiting, about how it wanted to be let in, about how it was lonely. Days passed like that, each one colder than the last. The house grew quiet as though listening, the mirrors fogged without reason, The lights flickered in patterns that almost formed rhythm, and every evening, just before midnight, the knocking returned. Always the same. 3 taps, pause, 2 more. The sound no longer frightened me. It exhausted me. I began to sense that whatever was outside, or inside, wasn't trying to harm us. It was trying to communicate. It wanted acknowledgement. One night, as the knock came again, I did something I swore I wouldn't. I spoke to it. My voice was low, trembling but deliberate, asking what it wanted, what it was looking for. The silence that followed was thick, endless. And then, slowly from the other side of the door, came a voice that was both strange and heartbreakingly familiar. It was the boy. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't meant to bring it with him, that when he saw it the first time, it had already chosen him, and that the only way to escape it was to pass the invitation to someone else. He said he had thought we would be safe if we never opened the door. He said it was old, older than names, older than fear itself, that it lived between thresholds, feeding on moments of hesitation, that brief second when you decide whether to open or to turn away. It didn't need to come in. It just needed to be acknowledged. My knees weakened beneath me as I listened, tears stinging my eyes as the truth sank in. The boy hadn't vanished. He had been taken by something that lives in the spaces between yes and no, between light and dark, between the hand reaching for the lock and the heart whispering not to. And now, because he had crossed our threshold, it had found us too. I whispered to the door that we forgave him, that none of this was his fault. For a moment, there was silence. Then, softly, almost tenderly, the voice said, "Thank you," and was gone. The knocking never came again after that night. The air felt lighter, the house quieter, though not empty. My son slept through the night for the first time in weeks, his breathing deep and even. When morning came, sunlight filled the rooms in a way it hadn't before, golden and warm, chasing away the gray that had lingered for too long. For the first time, I believed it was over. Still, sometimes when I walk past that door at night, I swear I can hear something faint. Not knocking, not whispering, just the quiet rhythm of breath on the other side, waiting. The days that followed unfolded like the slow thaw after a long and bitter winter, hesitant at first, unsure of whether the warmth was truly safe to return. The air in the house no longer felt heavy. It breathed again. The walls no longer hummed with tension, and the mirrors reflected only what they were meant to. Sunlight returned to corners that had forgotten what light looked like, and my son began to smile again. Not the fragile, fleeting kind of smile that hides fear behind its edges, but the genuine kind that comes when something wounded deep inside you begins to heal. It was subtle at first. A laugh over breakfast, the clatter of toys in the living room, the sound of music drifting faintly through the hallway. But those sounds became our proof that life had resumed its rightful place here. The house had let go of something, or maybe we had. I spent many mornings sitting by that same kitchen window, the one that looked out onto our quiet street, watching the simple rhythm of life unfold beyond the glass. Cars passed, children laughed, birds chased one another across the rooftops, and I realized how much I had taken that normalcy for granted. There was a beauty in the ordinary. A fragile kind of grace in the fact that the world kept moving forward, no matter how much darkness had brushed against it. Sometimes, I would catch myself staring at the front door, remembering the way the air used to hum with something unseen, and though a flicker of unease would ripple through me, it would fade quickly, replaced by a calm acceptance. Fear, I learned, does not leave you completely. It becomes part of the landscape, a shadow that reminds you of the light's value. My son no longer spoke of the boy, though I knew he remembered. Children carry memories differently, not as sharp lines, but as soft impressions, feelings rather than facts. One afternoon, I found him sitting on the front steps, looking at the sky with an expression that was almost peaceful. When I asked what he was thinking, he said he hoped his friend had found where he was supposed to go. There was something unshakably pure in that, an understanding that some things aren't meant to be solved, only accepted. That night, when I tucked him in, he whispered that the dreams had stopped. I believed him. Still, every so often, when the house settles at night and the wind brushes softly against the windows, I find myself listening, not out of fear, but out of a strange, tender longing, as if some small part of me wants to know that the boy found peace, that whatever ancient thing haunted the threshold has finally gone to rest. Sometimes, I imagine that the knocking we once feared wasn't a threat at all, but a call for recognition, a reminder of how fragile the barrier is between worlds, between understanding and ignorance, between love and loss. And in that thought, oddly enough, I find comfort. Because if something so old, so vast, so rooted in shadow can reach out not to destroy, but to be acknowledged, then maybe even the darkest things are not beyond redemption. There's a quiet truth that lingers after experiences like this, that every door we fear hides not just danger, but revelation. We live our lives surrounded by thresholds, the ones between sleep and waking, memory and forgetting, grief and healing. Some doors must stay closed for our safety, but others must be opened so that the light can pass through again. I think now about that night, about the moment I almost turned the lock, and I realize that what saved us wasn't just obedience to a warning, it was trust. Trust in a voice filled with fear, trust in the instinct to protect rather than to know. That, I think, is what kept us alive. Weeks later, we moved the houseplants back to the hallway, hung new pictures where the walls had once seemed to shiver in silence, and tried to reclaim what had been taken. Life resumed with quiet dignity, each day a small act of defiance against the lingering whisper of what had been. But there was one final thing I did before I let the past settle completely. One morning, just after dawn, I walked to the front door, opened it wide, and let the sunlight flood through. The air that rushed in was clean, cool, and sweet, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shimmer in the distance, a faint outline dissolving like mist in the warmth. I didn't feel fear then, only gratitude. That was the last time I ever thought of the knocking as something to dread. It became instead a story, one I carry quietly, one I share with those who understand that sometimes the most terrifying encounters are also the ones that teach us how to live again. I don't know where the boy is now, or what became of that ancient presence that once stood outside our door, but I believe that in some way, both have found peace. Perhaps one became part of the other, or perhaps they both simply moved on, leaving behind only the faint echo of a warning that turned out to be salvation in disguise. Now, when my son runs through the yard, laughter cutting clean through the morning air, I feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, the simple, luminous weight of gratitude for survival, for mystery, for the unbroken rhythm of days. The door, once a symbol of fear, stands now as a guardian of memory, a quiet reminder that we are defined not by what we avoid, but by what we choose to face with courage. And though I still sometimes pause before it at night, listening to the soft hush of the wind brushing against its frame, I no longer hear the echo of dread. I hear only life, steady, patient, enduring. And if there is one thing I have learned through all of this, it's that darkness will always knock. It will always ask to be seen, to be known. But the real power lies not in opening or closing the door. It lies in choosing to stand before it, unafraid, anchored by love and light. Because in the end, that is what keeps the shadows from crossing over. That is what keeps us whole. So if this story finds you tonight, wherever you are, remember this. Fear is not the end of the story. It's only the beginning of courage. Hold close to those you love. Keep your thresholds guarded with faith, not with walls. And never forget that even the quietest knock can be a reminder that you are still here, alive, aware, and capable of light. If this story touched you, leave a like and subscribe, not for me, but so that we can keep walking through these stories together, finding the pieces of light hidden in the dark. Because every story, no matter how haunted, deserves to end with hope.